Here are the steps to create crisp, super flat seams when you are foundation paper piecing. Step 1. Step 1, you need the right thread. I use Wonderfill Deco Bob, which is an 80 weight poly thread, which means it's very thin but super strong. So what that does is it creates less bulk between your seams. Step 2 is starch. So you can use whatever starch you like. I'm out of Best Press, but I have Faultless, so I'm using that. Starch your fabric before you sew. And make sure it is nice and crisp before you even cut into it. So you can do that piece by piece, or you can do your entire yardage all at once. Totally up to you, but starch your fabric. Next, when you go to actually sew your piece, make sure your thread stitch length is 1.30 or 1.35. I prefer a shorter stitch length so that you don't see the stitches in between when you iron it over, and it creates a very crisp, clean seam line. Next step, when you go on to sew a shape, make sure that the sew line matches the grain of the fabric and not the bias. If you sew on the bias, even if it's the tiniest piece, you might get wonky seams that don't lay flat. So make sure when you are sewing a shape that the sew line is against the grain of the fabric, the taut side, and not the bias. So once you finish sewing your shape, make sure to trim off the excess fabric. I'm going to try to do this with one hand. You just need to kind of eyeball 1/4 inch. It doesn't have to be perfect. This will reduce bulk and make your seams flat. Step is ironing. Once you have cut the excess fabric, you're going to flip it over, open your paper. You're going to press with your fingers from the middle and just lightly press. Then you're going to take a really nice hot iron with no steam. I love the Oliso Mini. And you're just going to press on top. And by press, I mean you're not going to swish it back and forth. You just press. And then immediately you place a tailor's clapper and press down. This is maple. It's 6 inches by, I think, 1/2 inch, and it works awesome. And there you have it. Super crisp, flat seams. Happy sewing. So when you are joining together sections, right? So you have 2 sections that you've sewn together. This is the tip for how to make the seams as flat as possible. I take out the paper within the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I take out some of the paper over the seam so that when I iron it over, the paper is gone because the paper creates more bulk, right? So you want, whenever you are joining seams, you want to be able to take out the paper along the 1/4 inch seam and then a little after the seam, and that'll help reduce bulk. So I hope this is helpful to you in creating crisp, flat seams. I know folks do different things. Do what works for you. Now, these steps are repeated for each and every time you sew. So it's important not to miss any of these steps when you sew a new seam line. Sometimes it's better to take the little extra time with the ironing, with the tailor's clapper, with the trimming, because the overall effect will be super, super flat, nice, clean, and beautiful. Happy sewing.